Hi, Precious.
Hi, Nana. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's so good to talk to you again. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. It's very nice to be reunited for this purpose.
Reunited and it feels so good. Yes,
hmm
definitely. Definitely. How was your holiday?
It was it was
Oh,
good. It was very relaxing. I actually took a decent chunk of time for myself to relax, but as practice owner things go, I
mm,
had to fit in some work somewhere along the way. But it was a big lesson I'm learning in that when it comes to when you're not on someone else's time, when you're not on someone else's W-2, tax form, you
mm,
really have to be mindful of giving yourself structure and giving yourself imposing boundaries on your own self. So I made sure that I took time to rest and relax while also getting some work done because the work still has to be done.
good, good, good. And now we're post-holiday. I hope you're still sort of sticking to that principle. Are you all able to achieve some semblance of a work-life balance in your life?
It's that is a dynamic goal. That's always a work in progress. But I will say that this year I'm making more of a conscious effort to fit in like pre-scheduled breaks. I
Good,
think we kind of touched on this last time as well, but when you like what you do and you have fun doing what you do, it's very easy to get carried away. And before you know it, the burnout starts to creep in.
right.
Passion for your work and burnout can definitely coexist. So I'm making more of an intentional effort this year to actually put in regularly scheduled breaks just to recoup and recuperate and regenerate my brain, and then we'll see how it goes. This is the goal. We'll see if I'm
Sure.
actually successful at that goal, but it's one of my very clearly stated goal
Good.
in terms of professional functioning for this year.
Definitely. Okay. Well, I definitely want to follow up on how that passion has been going, whether it's been seeing you through. But let's rewind a little bit because, just in case, I want everyone to know, I had the pleasure of interviewing Precious about a year ago. It was like around the holidays, I remember. And I just wanted to do a follow up and see where she is now. But let's sort of set the stage for everyone, I guess. So, Precious, can you give like a little brief introduction about yourself and just, what brought us together?
Absolutely. My name is Dr. Precious Ogu. I am a clinical and forensic neuropsychologist based here in Tampa, Florida, sunny Tampa, Florida. And I own and operate my private practice, Zenith Neuropsychology, here out of Tampa. And that's the very brief and general introduction. Do you want me to say more?
Why don't you define what a forensic neuropsychologist is for those of us who may not know?
Absolutely. So I'll start by defining what a neuropsychologist is. A neuropsychologist is, in my case, a clinical psychologist who specializes in the evaluation and the diagnosis of brain behavior conditions. So anything that affects your brain and in turns affects your behavioral functions, we aid in the evaluation and diagnosis of such conditions. I practice neuropsychology on a clinical basis, meaning just general medical patients, referred to me by their doctors or self-referred. I also practice neuropsychology in the forensic realm. And what that means, a forensic neuropsychologist is essentially an expert who applies neuropsychological principles to answer specified psycholegal questions. So in legal cases, be they criminal or civil, if they get to a juncture where there's a psycholegal question, a question about either psychological functioning or neuropsychological, neurocognitive functions that the judicial process feels will aid in processing the case or trying the case or resolving the case, then they would seek our help to answer that specific forensic question. So that's essentially what a forensic neuropsychologist is, and I practice both clinically and forensically.
Sure. Great, great. I really want to touch on that because I think people sometimes have perhaps a skewed perception of the integration of forensics and psychology. And I know there's a lot of TV shows, but I want to sort of make it more realistic and set a picture of, can you give me an example of from recent or from before, as much as you want to share, like a recent case you had to do that involved applying your forensic neuropsychology skills?
Absolutely. So I practiced. I conduct both psycho because I am a clinical psychologist, both
Hmm.
psychological and neuropsychological forensic evaluations because neuropsychology is a specialty of
Hmm.
clinical psychology or general clinical psychology. So I guess I can give kind of two examples, one that's more psychological, one that's more neuropsychological. On the psychological basis, to give a very specific concrete example, recently I was retained by one of the parties involved in the criminal case to evaluate, to conduct essentially an insanity evaluation. And an insanity evaluation is essentially when the court or some party in judicial process wants to present evidence to support the idea that at the time an offense was committed, the individual in question or the accused was not of sound mind. They were, colloquially put, insane. They didn't know what they were doing, or they did not appreciate the criminality or the wrongness of their behavior at that time. So this was it was a murder case, a capital murder case. The individual is facing the death penalty because it was a very egregious death. And the defense actually retained me to conduct a psychological evaluation and present evidence to the court to show that this individual at the time this incident occurred was not in their right mind. So that's an example of a psychological evaluation that I'm commonly asked to conduct. In terms of a neuropsychological evaluation, very generally put, it typically falls in the realm of an individual is being accused of something, and I'm being retained either to prove or disprove the fact that because of some neurocognitive deficit, because of a neurological impairment, because of an impairment in their brain functions, they either had a reduced capacity to conform their behavior to society standards, or they were at increased risk for finding themselves in the situation they did, which would kind of play into sentencing in terms of giving them a lesser sentence than they would otherwise get. For example, let me think of a more concrete example for neuropsych. Recently, for some reason, I've been getting a lot of cases involving fire lately. Either people burning other people alive or people committing arson.
Oh.
I don't know why that there was a flurry of that over the past few months, but more specifically, I was recently retained by the defense to evaluate an individual who's being accused of committing an arson. And this is an individual who has just all the classic risk factors for an impaired brain. When they were in utero, the mother was using drugs and alcohol, which we know can damage the brain moving forward. And then they've had multiple brain injuries throughout their lives. So when a good attorney or an astute attorney looking at their client's history and seeing all these risk factors for an impaired brain will think to themselves, let's get a psychologist in here or neuropsychologist in here to see whether there's an aberration or abnormality of cognitive functions, of thinking and reasoning skills, or executive functioning, impulse control, to explain why this individual would find themselves in the situation that they did. And it's not necessarily to absolve anyone of anything, it's just to provide the most robust picture to the court. So the people who are making the decisions at the final stage have all the information they need to decide as fairly as they can.
Right, right. Wow. So, I think for people who are listening, when you're talking about, capital merger cases and arson and, immolation case, it sounds like such a high intensity role that you're kind of put in to make these evaluations and to make these assessments. And I'm curious, do you feel like your previous graduate school training or mentorships really have prepared you to be in these positions to do these cases? Or do you think it's more just a matter of experience as the mother that teaches you everything? What kind
Yeah.
of percentage would you attribute that to? Just being able to handle a case like this or be retained to, be in these cases?
Absolutely. That's a very good question. And I haven't really thought about that before. I think that there's nothing in terms of forensic work specifically, as you mentioned, these are very unique, very different circumstances than you would otherwise encounter in your typical line of being a neuropsychologist.
Mhm.
I don't think there's anything that could possibly prepare you for working in forensics other than actually working in forensics.
Mm.
Even those who've been doing this for decades, you think you've seen everything, and then all of a sudden there's a case in front of you that just has a constellation of circumstances that you've never encountered before, because human beings can be very predictable, but also can be very
Yeah,
unpredictable.
predictable,
So
yeah.
there's always going to be something you've never encountered before. But Just generally speaking, absolutely not. I did a 2-year fellowship in forensic neuropsychology before I entered into independence practice. And I got exposed to a very wide variety of cases and situations. And still in independent practice, I feel like I'm always on my toes because just by nature, by nature of human behavior, you really always have to be prepared to expect anything.
Hmm.
So to
Right.
more succinctly answer the question, no, there is no amount of preparation that can prepare you for being at the sort of forefront of the most abnormal versions of human behavior and
Right.
all the different iterations that can present as.
Definitely. Wow. Well, all the power to you for still being able to do this kind of work. I know it's not easy. I know one thing we talked about in our past interview, which I encourage everyone to go watch, is just the stress of your work almost requires you to also find some outlet. And you talked about how psychologists, go figure, have to seek therapy as well. And you talked a lot about how that's so important and that you should not sort of discount that. I'm kind of curious now, and now that we're talking, do you still really apply that idea of, you have to also seek your own sort of mental health therapy for yourself in what you do?
Absolutely. Even more so, the
Mhm.
more exposure you get. And that line of reasoning is quite frankly applies even just in clinical practice, but it's also very influenced by my experience in forensic practice, even more so than ever, because the longer you are in the field, the more you kind of, the more you're exposed to, the more you hold in your memory, the more you're impacted, the more
Mhm.
your view of the world is impacted, and your view of people is impacted, because we are working with people, and but with people who a lot of people would consider the worst versions of of just humanity.
Mm.
So I think like the longer you are in the field, the more of these experiences you hold in your repertoire, it's more likely to affect you. The longer you stay in it, the more strongly you could be affected if
Mm.
you don't take time to sort of manage that on your end. So even now, a year later, more so than ever, because I've seen more in the past year than I had seen the last time we spoke.
Mhm.
Absolutely 100%. I'm very much appreciative. I have sort of a new sense of appreciation for my professional network, my mentors, the people I can pick up the phone and call if I need to debrief or just unload. And it doesn't have to be a formal therapy session if that's
Mm.
not your thing, but just having some sort of outlet. It could be self-directed, it could be mediated by another party, but it is absolutely crucial to have some sort of outlet for your feelings, for your
Right.
conceptualizations, for the way things are affecting you 100%.
Definitely. That's good. I'm glad you have those outlets, and I'm glad you have those mentors. And I'm wondering if you can just even talk a little bit more about those mentors. I know you mentioned that in your last interview, but I'm just curious how those relationships have sort of been sustained to this day, even though you're sort of out as a working professional now.
I That's such a good question. I consider myself very lucky that even with last time we spoke, I talked about both positive and negative, lots of negative experiences I had
You
on
did,
this
yeah.
journey to become a neuropsychologist. I'm very lucky that the positive experiences I did have were in the form of mentors and people who really, for whatever reason, because I don't I never they never demanded anything from me, they just saw me and they wanted to see me grow and they wanted to see me succeed, and they invested the most important asset that they ever could in me, which is their time.
Time.
And I'm very lucky that when people approach me in that way, then I feel more comfortable. I feel more motivated to maintain that relationship. When someone is coming approaching you in a manner that says, I don't want anything from you, I don't, I just want to see you grow, grow further and further from where you are, that motivates me to do everything I can to maintain those relationships. And it's one of the greatest assets in terms of maintaining stable mental health, I will say, as a neuropsychologist, as an independent practitioner, regardless of the setting. And I think that one of the interesting things that's also happened now that I'm an independent practitioner is when my mentors call me to pick my brain and to
Wow.
see what I think about certain things. And the first time it happened, I was like, whoa, but I don't know anything. Like you're my mentor. Like you should be pouring into me. But that was very interesting because it does make you realize that you really have grown and you really have come far. And they wouldn't be asking your opinion if they didn't think you had anything sound to offer.
Right.
So it's very interesting that it's evolved now to this sort of bi-directional symbiotic relationship where I'm helping, you're mentoring me, but at the same time, I feel so happy and so grateful to be able to give back to them. And whenever I get a call from my most cherished mentors, it doesn't matter what time of day or night, I drop everything. I just want to like give them every single thing I have because I
Right.
remember when I was struggling and they saw me and they without asking for anything in return felt the need to pour into me, and they are big reasons why I am where I am today. So now whenever they reach out to me, the imposter syndrome is the first reaction. I'm like,
Yes.
I don't have anything for you, but immediately I get over that and I switch into, okay, I want to give you everything I possibly can because it's the least I could do to repay you from when you poured into me when I felt like
Of course.
I was completely destitute and had nothing else.
Of course. Of course. Let's talk a little bit about struggles in the context of Zenith, if that's okay.
Of
So
course.
last year you were, I was very curious about you founding Zenith, and you said, I remember, you had to be everything. You were not just a psychologist, you were the business person, you were the janitor, you were the
Yes.
psychometrician, you had to be everything for everyone.
Everything.
And
Everything.
so I'm kind of curious how that dynamic is now. I actually remember when I put out the interview, a lot of people had said in the kindest way possible, "Oh my gosh, how is she gonna fare?" She said she's never taken a business class before. Wow, I mean that's a lot. And so, I had all the faith in you, and I knew that you would be able to succeed just because of who
Thank
you are. But
you.
I am kind of curious, like, what is it like today? Like, do you feel like you have your foot on the ground still in every aspect, or have you been able to sort of somewhat distribute the workload at all? What is sort of like dynamic with you sort of being the lead of everything now with Zenith?
This is where I will have to sort of give myself some credit and pat myself on the back because I did fare well. What I wouldn't have made such an attempt if I didn't think I would do it. I don't like to be embarrassed. If I know that I'm not the person who's like, oh, I'm gonna fail, but I'm gonna try anyway. If I know there's a good chance of me failing, I'm not gonna try. I don't want my ego to be hurt, to be bruised.
Right.
So I knew that the skills I had and the traits and the characteristics I had would position me more for success on that journey than failure. And of course, there's always the chance of failure, but I had enough faith in my skills and abilities to take that leap. So yeah, I knew that I had a hustle mentality, and I knew that I was a go getter. I knew that if I failed, it wouldn't be from lack of trying or a lack of knowledge or a lack of persistence. So I fared pretty well in the beginning doing everything. But of course, as the practice grew, it got to the point where it was just not tenable.
Sure.
I had to delegate and I had to get help. And of course, to be quite frank, initially, the reason I had to do everything was because remember, I started all of this on my own. I don't
Hmm.
have wealthy benefactors. We don't have family money hidden somewhere. I did everything off of my own back and my own hard work and my own sweat. So it was a financial decision. I couldn't afford to hire any staff.
Right.
If the practice was going to be alive, I had to do all those things. Somebody had to do it, and I couldn't afford to pay anyone to do it. So, luckily, as things grew and the financial situation became more tenable, I realized that it was time to sort of bring in help.
Hmm.
Thankfully, I was able to get some staff to help me out, a medical assistant, psychometrist. And just the other day, over the holidays, when I finally took a break, I found myself sitting and thinking and asking the same questions those people were asking you. How on earth did you manage in the beginning?
Yes.
You really, it's very funny because you really don't know how much perseverance you have until you're in a situation where you have no choice but to persevere.
Right.
But because I'm sitting here today talking to you and thinking of all the things I had to do in the beginning, and I cannot even imagine that I put myself in that position. I must have been very determined because I cannot fathom how I was able to do all those things at that time. And distance always gives perspective. Distance time wise, when you're removed from a situation,
Hmm.
it gives you perspective. But I do think, now in the present time, I asked myself the same questions those people were asking you was how did I even make it through? How was I doing my own testing, scheduling my own appointments, scoring all the data myself,
Hmm.
writing all the reports, doing all the marketing, reaching out to how was I doing all that, in addition to all the other administrative duties that are necessary when you're starting a practice, which is setting up protocols, setting up processes. How was I doing that as one person? I honestly don't know how, but I was put in a pressure cooker where I had to do it, and I got it
Right.
done.
Right.
Well, I
Amazing.
put myself in that pressure
You
cooker. No
did.
one, no one sent me to do this. This is my choice.
Yeah.
I put myself in the pressure cooker and I got it done. And my big piece of advice regarding that is you have to know the limits of your abilities. You
Right.
have to be the most honest person with yourself, because if things don't work out, the fallout will be on you. Will be your
Right.
fallout to bear. So if you have to have a very realistic appraisal of what you're able to do and what you're not able to do. And I looked at myself at the time and I said, this is probably going to be one of the hardest things you've ever done, because you're using a lot of parts of your brain that you've never used before, and you're learning a lot of new things. Do you think that you can do this? And if I had an honest conversation with myself and I decided that I couldn't do it, I would not have attempted it. So I will always say, you have to be honest with yourself and you have to have a good idea of where your limits are.
Yes.
Otherwise, if you're doing it just because it sounds good or just because you want to do what the next person is doing, you're already preemptively setting yourself up for failure.
Right. Right. And I want to talk a little bit about that because, even though we're talking in the topic of psychology, I think this really can be generalized to anyone who is going out into business for themselves and sort of the considerations of, oh, how do I get a small business loan? Do I go to the bank? Do I go to a family friend? And I know these are all things you had to sort of think about and consider. And in terms of lessons learned, you definitely have the right to pat yourself on the back. But I'm also curious, what are the things that you look back and you're like, oh, I wish I had done this a little bit differently. Oh, I could have done this better. What are sort of like the lessons learned that you would want to pass on to anyone else who finds themselves in your position in the future, looking to start going to business for themselves?
I'm gonna have to think about that, because my initial response internally was nothing.
Okay.
everything that, everything that I did, for better or for worse, was such a necessary learning experience.
Mm,
But let me actually think about that and see if there's anything that I would rather have done differently. I do know that the one thing that people always tell me is, "Oh, why didn't you get a loan?
yes.
Why did you have to, build it yourself? And why didn't you just, get a loan and make it easy for yourself?" And the answer is very simple. I'm not a finance guru by any means. I just, at the end of the day, like I said earlier, I just know what works for me, what I'm able
Mhm.
to tolerate and what I'm not. And I knew that after suffering for all these years as a broke grad student, the last thing I wanted to do was take on more debt and give people
Mm,
more interest.
I see.
Let me pay back the interest I owe my student loans before I start accruing more debt. So that was a decision that I had to make, was that, are you willing to take on even more? Look at your financial situation. Look at how you view money and finances. Is this an additional burden that you want to take on? Because you're either going to take on the burden of borrowing money and paying it back with interest,
Mhm.
or you're going to take on the burden of really, really struggling when you're working your tail off 18-hour days, and every penny that's coming in is going towards startup costs.
Right.
But you're working very hard, but you're not really seeing the fruits of your labor. That's its
Mhm.
own kind of burden.
Right.
That can be very, very psychologically demoralizing when you're working to the point of psychosomatic symptoms of stress and you're not really seeing the fruits of that labor.
Right.
So you just have to think of what kind of burden and risk that you're willing to tolerate. But I knew, it may be the Nigerian in me, but I was like, I don't want to give anybody any more free money. I
Yes.
want to keep everything. I don't care if I have to eat beans and rice every day. I want to keep everything. I'm tired of paying people interest.
Right.
So that's the first thing a lot of people say is, why didn't you just borrow money and do it?
Mhm.
Because I didn't want to. It didn't
Right.
work for me. It didn't work for
Right.
me logistically. It didn't work for me psychologically. Just that was not an option I was interested in.
Definitely.
Um, I'm trying to think. And maybe if I had more time to think about that question, I may actually have an answer, because I don't like to say nothing because it sounds unlikely or unrealistic, but I can't really think of any big decision I made that I wish I made differently. And that's because I just have a natural approach towards life where I think everything is a lesson, both
Yes,
the
that's
good and the
true.
bad. It's very hard for me to look at a situation and have regrets.
Right.
because I automatically think of everything I learned from that situation that I will apply in the future. So I'm not really someone that lives with regrets or always looks at the downside of things. I if anything like undesirable happens, I don't dwell too much on the negative fallout. I'm immediately thinking of how to turn that into
A positive.
positive, or how
Hmm.
to prevent that from happening in the future. So I
Definitely.
can't think of anything that happened that would devastated me so much that I wished it didn't happen.
Right. Right.
Even in the horrible, stressful times, everything was a learning opportunity. And
Sure.
that's because I was in the learning phase.
Right.
My mindset was learning oriented at the time. Now, if I've been doing this for 30 years, maybe that'd be different. But at the time, over the past year, since I started Zenith, I've been in learning mode. So even the bad things were like, it was like class to me. It was like a lesson. It was
Mhm.
like a lecture on okay, how to move forward in a more productive way. So I
Right.
can't really think of anything that happened that knocked me down so bad that I wish I did it differently, because I wasn't even in the mindset to sit in
Right.
regret.
And I actually think that mindset of not living life in regret is, in general, a very healthy mindset, in my opinion. Just to sort of have that idea of you're taking everything you learn and you're just making it into a lesson, and that's like a step that you're building up towards. I love that. And one thing you touched upon is, in your situation, you were a grad student. You mentioned sort of, being broke, and I think sometimes we don't really appreciate that aspect of being a grad student enough. There's an underbelly of, yes, you can get grants and funding from this, that, and the third from your school or from the government, but there is that financial struggle, and that's why sometimes for some people it wouldn't be in their best interest to get a loan. So I think you actually touched upon a good lesson, which is you need to do what's best for you, whether that might be a small
Absolutely.
business loan, deciding, know what, that's not for me right now. You always have to sort of realize like your path is going to be different from other people's path, and I love that you recognize that, because actually you let's just talk about it. That was one thing people brought up when they were talking. Oh, why didn't you get a small business loan? And I was like, well, you have to talk to her more about that. I don't know.
Mhm.
I just interviewed her, but that's a good
Direct
point.
the question to
Yeah,
the proper person.
yeah. I was like, here's her information if you want to talk to her about that, sure. But I think that's a really valid point, which is that you have to do what works for you. And you were coming at it a little bit uniquely because you were a grad student who had gone through a lot, and your situation will be different from other people's. And I think that's important. And I wasn't sure whether I was going to really talk about this, but let's just get to it. You
Let's
had
get into
mentioned it.
it,
You
man.
had
We're
mentioned
almost here. We got time. Let's do it.
you had mentioned in your last interview something like, unlike our former president who had a nice loan and he was able to start his own. Remember
Exactly.
that? You didn't have that thing, and
I did not. And my parents were like,
yes,
if it fails, you can come home, but there's no pot of money to give you. Like you gotta
definitely,
try your best.
yeah,
They were offered a lot of moral support, put it
which
that
is
way.
good,
But
which is
there
important.
was no small business loan of $1 million just in
Yes.
case it all fails. If it failed, it failed, and that was the end of the story. And I think that it also depends on your level of risk tolerance. Like
Hmm.
it's funny because I think on a personal level, I have a very low frustration tolerance. Like if nonsense is happening, I just remove myself immediately. I don't have
Right.
patience for that. But on a professional level, I realize that I will tolerate a lot. So
Mm,
my practice is successful. So my business is successful. So I was willing to really, really, deal with all the suffering that comes with everything I just described, just to avoid having to go the route of borrowing money. And let's just talk about it explicitly. I didn't want to borrow money from anyone.
hmm.
It's not that's not a risk I wanted to take, because it wasn't like I had worked a few years for a hospital and saved up money. I
Right.
literally started Zenith the day after my last day of fellowship.
Wow.
So if it didn't work out, let's say I borrow $200,000 from someone, if it doesn't work out, where's the money going to come from
Right.
to pay them?
Hmm.
So it was a very logical and rational decision.
Hmm.
But on the other side of that, I knew that I was really going to be overextending myself on a sort of physical and stress level. I was really going to be pushing myself to my
Hmm.
limits just to avoid going that route. So
Right.
it all depends. Some people don't have the patience for that. Some people cannot tolerate working and not getting paid, or not
Right.
seeing the fruits of their labor. And
Hmm.
of course, there are certain, to talk about even more explicitly, there are certain things that I don't want to say privileges, but there are certain circumstances that made it easy for me to take the risk of just not caring if I had money to buy food. Like I don't have parents depending on me. I mean, I have parents, but they're not depending on me.
Right.
I don't have children to feed. If anyone was going to starve, it was going to be me. If anyone was going to have to walk because they couldn't buy gas, it was going to be me. So that made it a lot easier to make that decision.
Sure.
to really, really, really inconvenience myself. And it was a major inconvenience to be working and not seeing money in your account because that money is going right back into startup costs was a major inconvenience, especially at the age that we're in. Life is expensive. So
Yes.
it was just I looked at the risks and the consequences and the pros and the cons and decided what I was going to be comfortable with. And I decided that I was going to be comfortable with the level of discomfort that it would take to not have to borrow money to start my practice.
Right. Definitely. You talked in our last interview about just how the structure of, let's just say, America kind of creates a system where sometimes you're just not even being supported by your own colleagues. And you kind of talked about how previously you sort of had made a fallacy of holding some of your colleagues to a higher standard, but then realizing, oh, the structure here just doesn't lend support to me. I'm kind of curious, were you, or how, I guess, over the this past year, have you sort of been more aware of that? Because you talk a lot about the support, and I'm so glad you have the support. But do you sometimes feel like you're still fighting against a tide that doesn't allow someone like you to succeed, or doesn't really embrace you the way that you feel like you should be embraced if you were another skin color? Let's
One
kind of.
thousand percent. I think that as long as I exist in this skin and in this gender and in this demographic in the United States, that will never be an issue that goes away. It's an issue that I experience in multiple facets, multiple interfaces in my career, be it interfacing with patients, with referral sources, with other attorneys, with the judicial system, with financial institutions. It never
Mm,
goes away. If people have the mindset of making snap judgments based on appearances, they're going to do that. It doesn't matter whether you're a student or whether you're in an independent practice. I will say 100% it's something that I still face on a constant basis. It's never going to go away. And it's unfortunate. But what I will say is that being in private practice can, especially if you're a solo private practice like I am currently, it's kind of insular. It insulates you from a lot of things. So I don't have to deal with anyone I don't want to deal with. And
mm,
I don't have to tolerate anything I don't want to tolerate because I don't want XYZ to go to HR. If someone is being disrespectful, it's at my discretion to handle that however I want to handle it. And with the confidence that comes with coming into your own as an independent practitioner, I'm finding that I'm handling those situations a lot more swiftly and a lot more vocally than I would have in the past. But it doesn't go away, especially, and I always bring this up because it's relevant, practicing in the part of the country that I practice in. That's those are situations that you just cannot escape.
which is
A lot of
Florida. Yes.
in Florida, yes,
Florida.
in Florida, in the South, in the
The
American
South.
South, there are a lot of people around these parts that lay eyes on you, and first of all, it doesn't even occur to them that you're the doctor. So when you then confirm that, then you see the looks on their faces and how their interactions with you change. You see how you start to notice nuances in their behavior, how they react to certain things, how they address you, how seriously they take you sometimes. And I think that again, being in private practice and having it's be at my complete discretion how I handle certain things. It's actually emboldened me. It's emboldened me to address these situations more swiftly and more severely, and also it's kind of being thrown into the deep end. If something happens, I can't run across the hall and consult with my other doctor. There's no other doctor. It's just me.
Right.
So you really have to you develop your own internal system, your internal code of ethics, your own internal set of rules on how you expect to be treated and how you treat people in return. You really have to do a lot of you really have to go through a mental sort of overhaul in terms of how you want to your professional identity, how you
Right.
want to identify as a professional and how you want people to identify you as a professional.
Right.
Um, I don't even know if that answered your question. I feel like I
No, it
went off
does.
there.
Definitely does. I want to even sort of boldly ask you, given what you've just shared, would you in some ways encourage Black students, graduates becoming up and coming, to sort of consider more of that private practice route as opposed to other routes, just because sometimes it may shield you from some of those systemic biases? Like, do you feel like that kind of benefited you that you chose private practice where you weren't sort of having to deal with those structures you mentioned, HR and all that? Do you feel like you would almost encourage, if students are feeling like I'm a minority in this field, I don't, I'm surrounded by people who don't look like me, would you almost say, well, kind of think about what I do, like go into more private practice? Do you think that's advice you would almost give people?
I'll answer that question two ways. First of all, I'll say I'm a huge proponent of, and this is not a great thing for a psychologist to say, but I think at a certain point, sitting in discomfort is not helpful. I think at a certain point, it's only hurting than helping. If
Mm,
you're in a situation where you're not comfortable and you've given it a chance and you've tried and you're still not comfortable, then you need to remove yourself from that situation, because it's not about tolerating discomfort, it's or building your frustration tolerance. It's about you're being harmed on a daily basis and you have to get out of there. But on the other hand, I wouldn't say at its baseline or at default that being in private practice protects you from the situation. I got to the point, to get to the point where you feel protected, you have to deal with a lot of sort of bad or scary situations to build that sort of to build that mindset, to build that identity, to build that approach that you want to take to people whenever certain things happen. So when I was first in independent practice and certain things would occur, I would be very terrified. I would be very scared. I'm sitting in a room, and you know how neuropsych testing goes. It's one-on-one. There's no one else in
mhm,
the room with you. I'm sitting in a room where someone is saying or doing certain things that make me feel threatened. That's a scary situation.
mm,
So in order to get to the point where you develop systems that shield you, you have to go through that trial by fire. So
right.
I wouldn't say automatically private practice would shield you, but you have to, again, it goes back to sort of knowing who you are, knowing what you're capable of, knowing what your limits are. You have to have a very strong internal sort of code of ethics and code of behavior, and sense of boundaries and sense of expectations of others, and sense of what you want others to expect from you to feel shielded in private practice. If
Mm,
you don't, and it's not a bad thing if you don't, we're all built differently, but if you don't have that strong sort of internal mental structure, you may not feel emboldened in private practice.
mm,
I belong to a lot of private practice sort of organizations or forums, and sometimes the questions that people ask, I'm just like, I know how I would handle that
right.
immediately. But I think to myself, the fact that you're asking this question, it kind of makes me concerned. And I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but the fact that you don't know what to do in this situation makes me concerned
Mhm,
that you're putting yourself in this sort of silo, in this isolated way of, I said isolated practice setting, and something like this is happening and you don't know how to handle it. That like worries me for you. Like I
mhm,
think maybe you would be better off in a setting where you're surrounded by people just for your own protection.
right.
So I don't think that being in private practice automatically shields you from anything. I think
I
that you
see.
have to have the mindset, and you have to at least be willing to learn how to manage and how to thrive in that kind of setting.
Right. That
I
makes
will
sense.
also say, yes, as I said before, in terms of working in systems that you feel are actively set up against you, you don't have to remain in them. And if you get to a
Mm,
situation where it's just becoming untenable, then you really have to ask yourself, would I fare better outside of the system?
mhm,
I made that decision very early. I have made zero regrets. I have zero regrets. It was very, as I said to you personally, I don't have very high frustration tolerance. The second I smell nonsense, I'm out. So I made that decision very, very early, but I also knew that it would put in a situation where I had to be my own bodyguard and my own backup
right.
mentally, physically, financially,
Mhm,
everything, that I would go down swinging, and I would do everything I could to thrive in that setting.
right. Right. And kind of recalling from our last talk, I believe part of what makes this something that you are happy to do, or something that kind of makes it sort of worth it, is that you get to be a face for people who are sort of being processed through the criminal justice system, who don't often see people who look like you. I mentioned in the last interview, you talked about how everyone from the judge to the lawyer to the prosecutor is non-black, or I guess white. And
Yes,
you talked about how you can be that only one person who's almost, not necessarily an advocate, but who's present in the system, who is black. And
yes.
I'm curious, have you still sort of found that something that you really observe, and something that you were sort of gives you a little bit of maybe happiness to see that you can sort of be that person for someone? That's something over the year that you have seen, and you've been able to sort of embrace and say, yeah, I have still kind of been that face for that person who doesn't see any other person who looks like him or her, sort of advocating for that, for him or her.
Absolutely. Till this very day, just a few days ago, an attorney came up to me and said, I'm just so happy to see not just a black person, but a black woman doing what you're doing. I,
Wow.
I get it all the time, to the point where it doesn't even register anymore when people say that to me, because it's just refreshing that even they realize the necessity for the diversity in this field of work, this very niche that we practice in. Even in my clinical practice, when we know that cognitive health in the Black community is a constant uphill battle with the medical
Mhm.
conditions that run rampant in our community and how those are related to cognitive decline, even like black patients coming in for an evaluation and seeing my face, and some of them tell me, that's the reason I went on your website and I saw you were Black and that's why I came in. And I'm like, I don't know if that's the best way to make your medical decisions, but I completely understand. I
Mhm.
would probably do the same thing given the historical context, and I'm not going to get too much into that right now, but absolutely, I still get that comment till this very day, and I'm sure that it's something that will continue to it's a comment, it's a feedback that I will continue to get. And
Right.
it's not just about just being Black, it's just also about the cultural competency that a lot of non-Black individuals lack, especially and I keep switching back between clinical and forensic, but going back to the forensic realm, having us be so overrepresented in that population,
Mm.
unfortunately. I've worked in a lot of cases where there was a clear cultural competency piece that was missing, and that would have changed the direction of the entire defense or the entire prosecution. And I had to bring it to people's attention because they weren't trying to ignore it, they just simply weren't aware of it.
Mm.
And then you have to think of, wow, like how many times has this happened and no one picked up on it? So I think even more so with each passing day, it's becoming clearer and clearer that we do need more diversity on the provider end, on the expert end, on the
Right.
doctor end. And that is not just in my head, because that is literally feedback I get from attorneys, from referral sources, from even defendants themselves. Even when I'm hired, I think I may have said this last time as well, even when I'm hired by the opposing party, the person I'm evaluating says like, wow, it's kind of cool that, to put it simply, it's kind of cool that you're Black. I think that gives them an extra level of comfort. It makes them more cooperative. It has all these sort of little benefits, but also on the bigger, more clinical end, it also adds a diversity of perspective that could be crucial in the case that would have been missed otherwise.
Right. And I want to just people to really think about that someone who even is seeing you as someone who's in some ways adversarial or kind of working against their interest can still recognize,
Absolutely.
I'm just glad you're here. I mean, that is pretty huge if you really
Yes.
think about it. And it kind of is a testament to the underrepresentation that kind of is permeating the system. And I think that's, quite frankly, I'm curious what, I mean, you're one voice who's, out there, but what do you think needs to be like a bigger sort of revolution to sort of stop these things from sort of not being recognized? And in your situation, for people to sort of really realize, like, we need to get more voices and more different sort of opinions in the system. It's not working the way it is now. What is sort of the bigger scale change that you think needs to be done?
I've really thought about this, and I think the best that I can think of is, because I'm not like, I don't know what field of study has concerns with. I don't even know what the field of study would be to study this, but I'm a psychologist. That's all I know how to do. But just thinking about it from those lens, I think it just comes down to recruitment. I think that we need to get in touch with the people who are interested in the field, get in touch with them earlier in their career before they get fixated on, I want to be at an AMC doing XYZ, and I want to be, before they get so concrete and fixated on these career goals, to let them know the breadth of opportunities that exist
Right.
and the breadth of settings that they could work in. And also, not just anybody, but mostly the Black and brown, burgeoning minds in the field of psychology. I try my best to, whenever I'm invited, go and talk to like undergraduate classes and any group of people who are willing, who want me to speak to them and are willing to listen. And I always interject that I'm not just coming here hanging out with you because I have nothing better to do, but this is like, I'm trying to sell you. I'm trying to advertise this field to you. Like, there
Mhm.
really is a need. There's a need for women. There's a need for minorities. There's a
Mhm.
need for minorities of every kind, because I think the perspective just creates a more, I don't want to say a more just system, but it just creates a more the information and the knowledge that's being shared is more robust when you have these different perspectives.
Right.
For example, just the other day, I was asked to evaluate an individual, a defendant, and she was a Black female who they were just they thought that they wanted me to evaluate her competency to stand trial,
Hmm.
because she just was they were having a hard time. Even her defense attorneys, they were having such a hard time working with her. They could not get her to cooperate. They said she was combative. They thought she was mentally ill. Like, she was just like, when you're actively working against the people trying to help you out, your defense team, that's kind of an indication that, oh,
Right.
something's not quite right. And I came in and I spoke to her, and this person who they thought was psychotic and mentally ill and raging and screaming at everyone, the this is a very oversimplified summary of my experience with her. But it turns out that a lot of the people that were working with her, her attorneys, the judge, everybody was male. And this is an individual who had very severe PTSD because of past trauma that she'd suffered at the hands of men.
Right.
But there was no way for that to come out because of of all the dysfunction between her trying to work with these people, and it just no one ever, they didn't know where she was coming from. She didn't
Right.
know where they were coming from, and every time they would try to work together, it would be this explosion.
Mm.
And all I had to do was just sit there. All I had to be was someone different, to just sit there and talk to her, rather than all these sort of white males in a position of authority barking orders to her. And
Right.
then the moment she doesn't want to comply, no one cares to understand why. They start drawing
Right.
all these conclusions.
Hmm.
And then the more they would call her crazy, the more she would react
Right.
negatively. And it just took her talking to someone who was a woman and who was a Black and who she saw something in common with, to really get to the root, the root of the psychological cause for all of this dysfunction, with her not being able to work with the court system and work with her attorneys. So that's just a very concrete example. It's not so much about being Black or being a woman. It's just more diversity is needed in certain settings,
Right.
because
Right.
it's at a certain point, it's just prohibitive. It causes more trouble if we stick to the status quo. Like, there's a
Right.
lot that could be missed when you don't have a diversity of perspective, or diversity of experts, or diversity of people who are in the sort of providing or helping role.
Right. Right. And I don't think people that's a great point. I don't think people really sometimes appreciate how much racial bias really permeates through like all systems, healthcare, our legal system. How even something like, you know, who gets priority on like, lung transplant, and who get I mean, there's just so many things that I read
Oh,
about,
we could
that
go
we could
deep
get
into
into.
that.
They're
Yeah,
very deep, yeah, with the concussion stuff in the NFL, which I
yes,
worked a little bit with, and
absolutely.
so there's just so much, and I think maybe some people don't want to hear it because we're sort of supposed to be post-racial. We won't get into that, yeah, but just how
Yeah,
sometimes we think that because the civil rights era is ended and we're all good now, we had a black president and almost had another one, but I think people just don't appreciate that there's just so much that like where bias permeates, and sometimes it really just hinders us from being able to evolve, I think, as a society. But
yes. And I
um,
think you touch on a very golden point in terms of observations that I've made from my little corner of the world. I think that, quite frankly, a lot of people just don't want to hear it.
right.
I think that the moment it's brought up, a lot of egos get very defensive. A lot of
Hmm.
people feel personally attacked, even though there is no personal attack anywhere in the vicinity. I think, quite frankly, a lot of people just don't want to hear it. And
Right.
if I'm going to call a thing, I'm going to call a thing a thing. A lot of people, especially, and I touched on this last time as well, especially those who are benefiting from the current power structures and those who are benefiting from the current status quo, they just don't want to hear it.
Right.
But
It
I
doesn't serve
always
them.
say it. I don't care who wants to hear it or not.
Yeah.
I'll always say it.
Yes. It doesn't serve them well, and also it's sometimes they just don't want to change. They don't want to kind of
I
change
want
with
to
the
change. It
times.
doesn't
Yep.
serve, because I point out, I say, this approach is costing you, and this is exactly how it's costing you.
Right.
So if you don't want to hear it at this point, that's a decision you're making that will have bad consequences. But you can't claim you didn't know, because I'm telling you right now. So whatever you do with that information is up to you. But we're way past the point of claiming ignorance. Like, no,
Right.
because we're telling you. So,
Right.
act accordingly.
Right. Right. Definitely. So I want to sort of conclude this about by going into something that you also talked about in the previous interview, which is you were giving me advice about sort of when you're kind of up and coming as a health practitioner, to really the biggest advice you gave me is to know yourself, like know who you want to be. And I think that's really, really important, kind of fast forward 1 year later, because, recently not trying to blow you on the spot, but you had posted something where you had talked about how you were so grateful that Zenith is doing well, and you're actually like getting people like doctors referring people to you, and how it's like such an honor to be so esteemed that people were actually like sort of saying like, I want you to work with her. She's great. And I could tell you how it wasn't coming from a place of vanity, but you were just so proud of what you had built and just the reputation that you had forged through all your hard work. And so when I think about your advice about sort of like knowing yourself and knowing who you want to be, especially in the system where sometimes they might try to tell you who you want to be, where do you really sort of get your sense of, I guess, worth? I mean, does it kind of come from these sort of like praises you get from other doctors, the people who are kind of referring? Is it more like internal? Is it a combination? What really sort of fuels you to be able to say, I made it. This is good. Zenith is thriving. People are taking notice of me. I'm doing a good job. Is it more external, or is it just sort of coming from like our community? I'm kind of curious, like kind of what kind of fuels you to say like I'm in the position that I want to be right now.
That's a very interesting question. I would say it's a combination in a way, but I will just initially it all starts with the you. It starts with the person,
Mm,
and I've always joked that I was born with way a much higher level of like self-esteem and believe in myself than I ever deserved. Like you've seen me at certain points in my life, you'd be like, where are you getting all this self-esteem from? Like, where's I've always said that. I always joke about that, but it's true that I'm naturally overly optimistic. I have a very like disturbingly high level of faith in my abilities. And
mhm.
that kind of leads me to try anything and go for anything. And if it fails, it fails. But hey, I believed I could do it.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the baseline is it starts with the you. You have to, and
Mm,
I think the running theme of this whole conversation has been just having a very good appraisal of your skills, your abilities, your
right.
talents, your good traits, your bad traits. You just have to know thyself. And I think that just to answer your question more directly, at baseline, I'm just naturally have a lot of belief in myself, even when I
Mhm.
had no reason to. I just naturally have a lot of belief in myself. And then, but when you, as with any other human, when you do things that you think are a good idea and others confirm that that was indeed a good idea, it inspires you. Well, first of all, it just validates you
Right. Validation. Mhm.
tremendously. And then it inspires you to continue to trust yourself because clearly you were right the first time.
Right.
So I think when I made that video, it was more from a place of disbelief. Like I think I'm great, but you don't have to agree with me. Like I think I'm the best, but I that's the thing again. I'm a very realistic person.
Right.
I'm hopelessly optimistic in many ways, but I'm also very realistic and I realize that what I think is what I think. I do not expect anyone else to agree with me. I essentially live in my own world 100%
Mhm.
of the time. So it was more like disbelief. Like I thought this was a good idea, and I knew that I was going to do everything humanly possible to make it happen. But not only does that person agree with me, but then that person and that person and that person, like, I guess I was right. Maybe my self esteem is not too high. Maybe it's just exactly where it needs to be. But it's a combination. It's a combination of just naturally, my brain is just naturally wired
Mhm.
to think of the to put my best foot forward and be
Right.
optimistic and hope things work out. But also that external validation for me is crucial,
Right.
especially when it comes to my business because like I don't some of my referral sources I've never met them face to face. All they know is
Right.
my work. All
Your
they
work.
know are
Yes.
the reports that they read. And they see the work product and they keep sending people back to me. At that point, it's not about me. It's about my talents and my abilities and what I'm able to do. So that is hugely gratifying. And I think I'm still in disbelief. It's going to be a long time before it actually sinks in that this idea that I had that people actually appreciate it and find it helpful. But yeah, I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of having an internal sense of who you are
Mhm.
and having that be validated externally by from multiple sources. I think that the marriage of the two is just like it's just unbelievable.
Wow, that's great. I think validation is so key because oftentimes we think, I don't need that. It's whatever. But
Need
you're
it.
right. It's very important. And but I like how you did bring it back to saying like it comes from you because it came from,
Absolutely.
a little seed of an idea you had, and it grew and you believed in yourself, and it's only sort of just the excess sort of like nourishment from, these referrals and these doctors who know you. And I actually forgot about that. They don't even know you personally. It's just like your reputation, which is, you know, makes
That's
it,
extra validating.
yeah, it's
That's how
actually
I
valid. Yeah.
feel. I'm
Yeah.
like, it's not because I'm like, oh, like, it's not because I'm kidding, but it's not because I'm cute. It's because they
Yeah.
actually think that I have a brain and that I'm using my brain
Right.
very well. And
Right.
we all have find validation in different things. Some people will be validated because they thought they were cute. I'm
Right.
validated when you think that I was after eating beans for a year straight because I didn't have any money, that all of that was worth it. That's
Right.
what validates me, that it wasn't a massive waste of time.
Right.
So, and actually, like everything that I went to school for, I actually learned something. Like
Right.
that's the evidence.
Right.
So it's just little things like that. But I think that the external validation piece, especially
Mhm.
in a private practice setting,
Yes.
especially in a solo provider private practice setting, where you don't have anyone patting you on the back anymore. You're not
Mhm.
in school. You don't have anyone giving you direct feedback. I don't have a whole bunch of coworkers around me all the time.
Mhm.
So the way that I know that I'm doing bad is when the phone stops ringing.
Right.
And that's a very difficult way to find out that, that your business isn't going anywhere. So the fact that there are not a lot of sources of feedback when you're a solo provider, private
Mhm.
practitioner. The feedback is the returning patient, the
Right.
doctors who keep sending you people, and the attorneys who keep hiring you.
Yes.
So not having that, like no one's doing a performance review of me every 3 months. So
Exactly.
missing that, it leaves you in a very precarious position. You
Mhm.
never know just exactly where you are in terms of doing a good job. So when you get all these indirect pieces of feedback or indirect sources of feedback, it's
Mhm.
so gratifying. It's like,
Right.
we live to fight another day.
Yes, definitely, definitely. And you have fought, and I just want to say, just personally, I'm so proud of everything that you've been able to do since you started as a student, learning about psychology. And again, everyone should go back to the interview to kind of see, how she got to this place. But I am so proud to see 1 year later how you're thriving and how the phones are continue to ring, and people are just being able to say, she is someone who's making a difference in this world. We need her. We need her in this field. So
You're too
congratulations.
kind. You're too kind. Thank you so much. I can't wait to see what the future holds. We definitely have plans, but we also have to
Okay.
pace ourselves. But
Hmm.
I can't wait to see what the future holds for Zenith. And it's been quite the journey. It's really just like a human toddler child. Like the first early years, so much transformation happens. Like you're
Hmm.
going to see
Hmm.
more change probably from year 1 to year 2 to year 3, then from year 3 to year 10. So I'm
Yes.
just savoring the process, and it's very interesting. And I've never done anything like this before. So it's very exciting. I'm learning a lot. But
Hmm.
thank you so much for those very kind words. Speaking of external validation, thank you so much. That
Of
really
course.
means a lot. And that inspires me to keep going. I hope that when we have this chat again, there will be even more to share.
I hope so too. Yes. Everyone, please remember that this is Precious Ogu, and she is the founder of Zenith. And stay tuned because there's more to come from her. There's so much more to come.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much
Thank
for
you
giving
so
me your
much,
time.
Anna. This was lovely as always.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.